So, welcome everybody. I'm Shannon Rudisell with the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative. It is great to have you join us for this Tax Day webinar. I have these flowers behind me, thanks to Rena Large, who made this stream. But earlier today, somebody said something about it. I'm like, maybe it should be dollar signs today since it's tax day. But I think these are prettier as much as we are in the United States. We love our dollar signs. But this is more beautiful for sure. So thank you so much for being with us, and we really are happy to have this conversation. Because it might take you a minute to think, I'm going to go ahead and give you our little chat icebreaker while I'm talking, which is put in the chat your favorite thing that our taxes pay for, something that you enjoy personally, that is paid for by taxes. So as we were getting ready and we were thinking about this, and because as you know, you'll find out if you don't know, we are planning this with some tax enthusiasts. And therefore we were in a very positive frame of mind about taxes. And so, as I was reflecting on it, we don't think about it this way very often, but taxes are the way that we do things together as a society, as a people, and in a time that we're all talking about the state of our country, the state of our communities, I'm loving the chat, by the way. Um, are we united? Are we divided? Like, just thinking about the fact that everything that we enjoy together, common spaces, as I see here, public parks, taxes are the way that we do those things together. Taxes are the way that we make them happen. And that's the way that we pay for the good stuff that we want for kids and families here at Early Childhood Funders Collaborative. And so one thing that we also were reflected on is if we think back to what I understand to be the beginnings of Early Childhood Funders Collaborative, some more than 30 years ago, one of the things that united the people who got together, our founding foundations, was an understanding that we needed more public investment in the early years. Because although they were investing and they were trying to bring along more of their colleagues, which if you've been working with ECFC, you know that we have brought along more foundation colleagues to invest, that in the end, really more public investment and actually coming up with ways to support working families and support the development of young children, that this was a public good and that public goods need public investment. And so that's been a value, a common understanding of Early Childhood Funders Collaborative and our members and our founders for over 30 years. So I think that this is the perfect day and the perfect time for us to be talking about that and to be remembering that that was one of the core things that brought us together. So I will say one bit of housekeeping, which is we have fabulous presenters, and you're going to hear from them, but we know you might have questions along the way. So I'm going to invite you to both think of them, but if you put them in the chat, we'll be monitoring that so we can help you remember them. Plus, it'll help them see what people are thinking about. They might be able to tailor their remarks a little bit. And with that, I am going to turn it over to one of our leaders who's very passionate on this topic, our steering committee member, Kathy Storr from Pritzker Children's Initiative, who is going to talk a little bit about how she sees this playing out with us here at ECFC and what brings her to this. So I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Storr. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. So good to see so many of you. So earlier this year, the ECFC Policy Committee had a conversation about policy priorities for 2026. And state revenue quickly bubbled up as a priority. And I will say for me, since HR 1 passed last summer, it's been feeling like watching a slow-moving freight train that's headed to the states, and it's going to threaten to wipe out a lot of things that we've all worked for a long time, and the ability of states to fund so many of the programs and services that we've come to count on. So by the end of that call, Shannon Katsaradas, David Jordan, and I had volunteered to explore the idea of creating a revenue work group for ECFC. And we enlisted Amy Nagel, who you're going to meet in a few minutes, to help us shape what it might look like to have a time-limited series of conversations for ECFC members to provide us with some learning opportunities, a chance to explore how early childhood funders could wade into revenue. It was really a very critical time, and to even possibly see if there are some gaps that we might be able to help fill. So we decided to do a soft launch of this idea on tax day to offer early childhood funders a chance to get together and hear from some funder peers in the tax and revenue space. So I'll tell you what we're gonna kind of run through today. So first, um, uh, sorry, I've just, of course, lost my screen with my dot points. So first, we're going to talk about the why. So why early childhood funders should lean into revenue or lean a little harder if we're not all the way there yet. And then we're going to do a quick walkthrough of some of the who's who on the national landscape, and as well as how that shows up in the states. And then two of our funder peers are going to be sharing some examples of how they support revenue work in their states. And we're going to have plenty of time at the end for questions. So as Shannon said, put them in the chat or hold on to them. So our hope today is that you leave with a clearer sense of why revenue is so critical and what it could look like to engage. And ideally, that this webinar today sparks enough curiosity that you'll want to be part of an ECFC revenue work group as it launches this spring. So with that, I am going to turn it to Sarah Prey, who is the Executive Director of Better Taxes for a Better America. She said there's no place she would rather spend tax day than with us. And she is going to share some thoughts with us on why what she does should matter to all of us. So Sarah, take it away.
Amazing. Thank you, Kathy, and happy tax day to all who celebrate, which is all of us, which is part of the beauty that we'll get into. Thank you so much for having me. I'm always happy to talk about tax revenue and budget. And especially thanks, I have some members on the call. Appreciate you all and the support. So real quick about what Better Taxes for a Better America is. We are a funder collaborative that aligns, coordinates existing donors that care about tax revenue and budget policy, brings in new donors. So it's a sort of on-ramp for those who maybe are curious and want to engage, but maybe don't know exactly how. We are a regranter, and when necessary, we actually house campaigns as we did last year around HR1. So if you're curious more about Better Taxes, you can always reach out to me or my colleague Jonathan, who's also on the call, Jonathan Osler. So I want to start with a truth that I think everybody here probably already feels, but just to put a fine point on it, that philanthropy is essential to the early childhood ecosystem, but is not and cannot be the sustainable financial solution to it. The math simply just doesn't work. So let's take one issue that I know many of you care about, childcare. So in the United States, the annual cost of a high quality, fully funded childcare system, and I know there's lots of numbers, and I bet Shannon will probably tell me that I'm wrong here, but the one that I found in my research is in the range of $600 to $700 billion a year, depending on assumptions about wages, access, and quality. Meanwhile, total philanthropic giving across all causes in the United States is roughly $557 billion annually. And only a tiny fraction of that, well under 2%, goes to early childhood. And that number is even lower, incidentally, for pro-tax philanthropy. It's about 0.25%. So even if every early childhood funder doubled, tripled, quadrupled their giving, we'd still be operating at the margins of a structural gap that measures in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So what can philanthropy do? Innovate, demonstrate, catalyze, but it cannot backfill a system that was never designed to be financially self-sustaining. So this also brings us to the second truth. And again, we're just using childcare as an example here. We could use many others, education, SNAP, etc. But childcare markets are not broken. They're behaving exactly as markets do when they're asked to deliver something that fundamentally resists market logic. So childcare is labor intensive. It requires low child to staff ratios. It can't be automated or scaled like other industries. Parents, especially young parents, cannot afford to pay the true cost of care, and providers cannot survive on what families can pay. Economists and policy experts widely describe this as a classic market failure where private markets alone cannot efficiently supply a socially necessary good. So what does that mean? The government must fill this gap. Every country that has achieved sustainable, affordable, high quality childcare has done so through consistent, predictable public investment, not through private giving alone, and not through sporadic or temporary funding streams. So the same is true here in the United States, whether we're talking about public education, healthcare, or infrastructure. So the question for philanthropy is not whether to fund childcare, but how to fund it in a way that leads to a high quality, sustainable system. And I know one of the arguments for funding in early childhood is the return on investment, right? If you invest in early childhood, that reaps long-term benefits for the person, the community, the economy, etc. I want to sort of use a similar argument today on the outsized return on investment that comes from funding revenue, tax policy, and public finance infrastructure. Because if the gap that we talked about is hundreds of billions of dollars just for one slice of the things that you all care about, then the only way to close it is to unlock public dollars at scale. And relatively small philanthropic investments in advocacy, policy design, organizing, and narrative change can generate orders of magnitude more funding through state and federal revenue. So I'm going to share my screen real quick here because I do have this little slide here. Hopefully you all can see it. The thing is glitching out here, but hopefully you all can see it. Yeah, thumbs up. No, that's a no.
Yes.
Thumbs up. Yay. Okay. So as we see here, $6 million in New Mexico is bringing in $900 million a year. $30 million in Massachusetts, bringing $3 billion a year. By the way, that's outperforming. Washington, $10 million campaign, bringing in $500 to $800 million a year. But by the way, this is the capital gains tax that was passed a few years ago, not the new millionaires tax that will bring in additional $3 to $4 billion annually. So we've seen this play out again and again, that a few $1 million invested in revenue campaigns can unlock billions in recurring public funding, particularly at the state level, where tax and budget decisions are made annually. These wins compound over time, they become part of the baseline. So when we invest in the infrastructure that makes public funding possible, we're not just filling a budget gap, we're strengthening the entire economic foundation of our communities. So to do that effectively, we do need to expand how we think about the role of philanthropy. This is just some numbers for you to chew on around the Massachusetts campaign, which I'm sure you've heard a ton about, but what's nice about that is we actually have the numbers that we can put on it from where this money is going to, obviously free community college and free school meals, et cetera. But too often, it seems like we fund focused on like programs or at the policy level on ballot initiatives tied to specific benefits. And although these are important, they're not enough on their own. So we need to support these durable statewide revenue strategies. And that means investing in the capacity to design equitable tax systems, to analyze fiscal policies, to build coalitions that can win and sustain revenue measures, to communicate effectively about why public investment matters. It means sustaining the infrastructure and the know-how that persist beyond any single campaign. There are a number of state organizers and legislators already committed to this work. They always need more support. And it also means being intentional about how that revenue is raised. So Kathy foreshadowed this a little bit. Regressive tax systems, that means those that place a higher burden on low and middle income families, which as you can see, that's the red here. So almost every single one undermine the very goals we're trying to achieve. So this comes from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, a really tremendous group. I sit on the board of directors. But as you can see, this shows that most state and local tax systems are regressive, making equitable revenue design essential to advancing family well-being. Tax credits, which I know many of you are interested in, are an important piece of this puzzle, not the only piece, but an important piece of it, because when they are well designed and targeted, tax credits can deliver immediate, tangible support to families, reducing the cost of raising children and improving economic stability. These tax credits, though, don't exist in a vacuum. They're funded through the same revenue systems we're talking about. So there's a direct connection between our ability to generate public revenue and our ability to deliver meaningful benefits to families, right? We have to raise the money in order to be able to give the tax credits. So raise the revenue, deploy it through tools like tax credits, subsidies, direct investments in care infrastructure. And listen, this is possible across the political spectrum. States of all political leanings have passed revenue measures, expanded tax credits, and invested in families. I know you know many of these examples, like child tax credits in states like Colorado, Maine, and Utah, sustained public funding for childcare in New Jersey, Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, California, of course, New Mexico. That's the poster child. And in many more states, efforts to raise revenues are well underway. So voters consistently support investments in education, healthcare, and childcare when they're clearly explained and credibly funded. It's not at its core a partisan issue. It is about whether families can afford to raise their children. So why is this moment so urgent? We are entering a period of significant fiscal pressure at the federal level, particularly in the wake of last year's HR 1, what was known as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So the combination of large-scale tax cuts and increased spending in other areas is already creating downward pressure on safety net programs and increasing fiscal deficits at the federal level. And then at the same time, we know that families are facing rising costs across the board: housing, food, energy, and care. It was already expensive to raise a child. It's getting increasingly more so. So we're starting to see the consequences. In Washington state, lawmakers have already moved to scale back childcare subsidies and early learning investments in response to these constraints. Without new revenue, more states are likely to follow. So we're quite literally in a race between rising costs and shrinking supports. There's reason for optimism, though, and this is where I'm going to leave you. So we know that polling consistently shows bipartisan support for increased investment in childcare, early education, family economic support. It's about, across the board, people believe that their country should invest in them and their children. We know this is popular, so there's opportunity to not just fund programs to help build this infrastructure that can sustain these programs at scale, to grow the pie. If you look at what the Better Taxes for a Better America logo is, it's a pie that we like to think is getting bigger. So we want to grow it not just of early childhood funding, but of funders ready to invest in revenue strategies across the board. So more durable solutions, and we know that the returns, economic, social, and human, will far exceed that investment. So philanthropy has always played a catalytic role in moments of transition, and this is one of those moments. So hope that sort of inspires you to maybe get a little bit more involved and hear more about what we can do, which is where we're headed. And I'm again, thank you for inviting me here to chat. I'm going to pass it over to another Better Taxes MVP, which is Shauna Bartley, Policy Officer at the Kellogg Foundation. Shauna, I think you're going to tell us a little bit about your journey from early childhood advocacy to tax girly.
Yes. Yes, thanks. I am a certified tax girly, so thank you, Sarah. I'll be underlining a lot of what you just shared, but and I'll also tell a story of what happens when we don't connect systems building policy to ongoing revenue debates. But first, it's great to be here with so many friends and to talk about why progressive revenue is essential to building strong early childhood systems. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Shauna Bartley. I'm on the policy advocacy team at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, where advancing early childhood systems is a core strategy for improving child and family well-being. When I joined the foundation in 2021, it was clear that my role on the policy team needed to be additive. We have outstanding early childhood experts, so my question was, what gap can our team's grant making fill? The answer for me was based on my career and pretty clear. We will not get to real coordinated early childhood systems without serious public investment. Before Kellogg, I spent most of my career as an early childhood policy advocate. At DC Action for Children, I helped lead the coalition that passed Birth to 3 DC in 2019, the nation's first comprehensive early childhood, or quite frankly, because we already had universal pre-K for a decade at that point, it was the first comprehensive infant toddler systems building legislation. Later, at the National Women's Law Center, I served as the first director of community partnerships for childcare and income security, advocating for educators and ECE workers during the earliest days of the pandemic. Those experiences taught me an important truth. If we continue to pit the needs of children and families against the needs of educators and providers, everyone loses. The only way to build a system that works is through significantly greater public investment that truly recognizes the value of early childhood systems and what those systems can provide to families, to workers, and to our economy. That's why a core part of my grant making now focuses on community-led advocacy for progressive revenue and equitable taxation as a strategy that truly advances child well-being. Governments, local, state, and federal, are the primary stewards of public resources. They fund education, healthcare, infrastructure, all the things you all named in the chat earlier, and all things that shape everyday life. Yeah, what we also know from all of our shared work is that historically marginalized communities too often fail to receive equitable benefits from public spending, even during periods of unprecedented investment, thinking back to the American Rescue Plan Act, the pandemic packages of CARES and HEROES, and even what we attempted to do during Build Back Better. So if we want public dollars to actually serve the communities they're meant to support, power has to shift, and communities must have a real role, not only in deciding how money is spent, but in shaping how revenue is raised in the first place. I saw all of this firsthand during the campaign for Under 3 DC. When the Birth to 3 for All DC Act passed in 2019, it did so subject to appropriations. The coalition accepted that compromise to get the bill across the finish line, knowing that it would require ongoing advocacy. What I couldn't predict was how that decision would turn essential funding into an annual fight that continues today. Every budget cycle, the coalition has to appeal once again to the mayor and the DC Council just to keep educators paid and services available. This happened even when the city was flush with cash and has worsened as we all prepare and brace for the impacts of HR 1. Even though DC does have a relatively progressive tax code and the coalition identified a revenue source later, the legislated programs have remained vulnerable to defunding. We saw this just last week when the mayor released her budget completely defunding the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. These experiences reinforce something fundamental. Policy wins are only as strong as the funding behind them. We will always need executive and legislative champions, but more than that, the money has to be there. Revenue creates the enabling conditions for success and growing the champions that we need. Our policy change strategies as grant makers must always ask two questions. Is the money there today, and will it continue to be there tomorrow and ongoing? While I will always love early childhood policy, I am clear the work rests on getting to the money. We cannot advance our goals without a clear strategy for progressive revenue and equitable taxation. This rings so true today when we see the challenges of the affordability crisis we're in. Families cannot pay more for the programs and services they need, and educators and providers cannot be asked to do more while getting paid less. The only entity with the capacity and the responsibility to close that gap is the government. And the government must deliver on its mandate to serve. As Sarah said, philanthropy can help incubate ideas and identify promising practices, but to get to scale, we need public investment and the revenue levels to get us there. So someone who can help us think more about this is the wonderful Amy Nagel. Amy is co-leader of two funder networks, Tax Equity Funders and Economic Opportunity Funders, and she's going to tell us about some of the key players at the national level and what it looks like when it all comes together in a state. Amy?
Yeah, thanks, Shauna. And it's lovely to see you all. I'm so glad to be here on Tax Day, which you can imagine is among our favorite days of the year. So again, I'm Amy Nagel with Economic Opportunity Funders, the Tax Equity Funders Network. the Tax Equity Funders Network. I know some of you on the line, but not very many of you. So it's always good to be with some new friends. Our network is almost 300 strong charitable foundations all across the nation, and sort of every make and model of charitable foundations who have found their way to tax work. Almost none of them have tax as a portfolio. It's almost always early childhood, health outcomes, strengthening communities, poverty reduction, and they have found their way to the rest of us working on tax as a way to help them achieve their philanthropic goals in these other domains. So I'm going to share my screen and tell you a little bit about kind of how we think about the space and the variety of other folks who are here to be with you on the journey. So when we think about work in the tax space, we think of it in 3 ways: financial burden, cash in the pocket strategies. This is largely about the tax credits and the ways in which we're making the tax bill as small as it can be and as least burdensome as it can be. We have a middle category that is about the upside down tax code, or the ways in which our tax code just at the national and state level just isn't generating enough funds for the things we want to do and for all of our families and communities need and deserve. And it's doing it in such an ineffective way. So lots to say about that. And then the third category work about unequal and biased processes, just the how of how we file taxes, especially on today, if we think about just how burdensome that is and actually how unequal it is. So that's how we organize the world. Let me say a little bit more about sort of what that works like, because of course our colleagues have already laid out a little bit about why it's so important and the why now, but let me sort of fill in some of the blanks on the what. So when we think about various funding strategies, but literally like, what are you all meant to fund? We think about it across those 3 categories. You can see there at the top: cash in the pocket, revenue generation, and the systems work. There's things that you can fund that are about programs, and things that you can fund that are about policy change. And you can see some things that'll look very recognizable to you. So if you're interested in the tax credits, it's outreach materials and translation and supporting those trusted messengers. On the policy side, funding policy and advocacy research or narrative work, things that'll be familiar to you. It's just here in the tax space. These are largely connected. And I know that we are zoning in this conversation, in that middle category on the revenue, but I'll tell you from our experience, our charitable foundations sometimes start in one of these and then they move to the other. So they might start with some very comfortable work around helping build coalitions and supporting that kind of work. And then it kind of builds over into, well, maybe we'll fund some research, and then maybe we'll fund some narrative work. So what we've often seen amongst our members is a first step that leads to very many other steps to make the work robust. And what's exceptional, we think, in this space is that we think about the funding in this work as really an ecosystem approach. So thinking about what you are funding is really tied into what you're already funding and the ways in which it already fits very naturally into your grant making portfolio. So for example, we have many foundations where they're really super comfortable is funding and research. And what is great is they can build out that portfolio and add some tax research as part of that, or make connections between their current research portfolio and the tax research portfolio, or in communications, or in organizing. And that, I think a key here is that no funder needs to do all of those things. We work together in collaboration to say, oh, you're funding some research, that's so amazing. I'm going to use those findings to help bolster my outreach and engagement campaigns. And so working together in this real ecosystem approach makes it just a lot easier for all of us to kind of be in this space together, and helps it be a much more natural outgrowth of your current giving. That is the framework that we use, and hope that helps you as you think about kind of how you are currently in this space, if you are entering this space, if you are growing in this space. I think also of really significant note is that there's a lot of capacity that has already been built after decades of work by our colleagues at the funding colleagues at the national and state levels to really build the capacity. Sarah talked about this earlier, this capacity that already exists that we all can tap in on. So I've just pulled out a little sampling just so that you can have some sense of like, who are these folks and how might they help me? So there are some national organizations, Center on Budget and Policy Parties, or our State Revenue Alliance as examples, who do a lot of work in this space and have state affiliates, folks who are probably working in your state who are tied into these networks and doing ongoing work in the tax and budget arena. In addition to that, we've also got a really big ecosystem of organizations who are doing research. Sarah already mentioned ITEP at the top of the call, but there's the Children's Funding Project and Tax Policy Center and the Tax Law Center and the SCAN and many others who are doing these really important core research so that each of us don't have to get out there and fund something on our own. And this is just a sampling. There are, of course, others who are doing message testing and working on coalition building. And then in addition to that, you've got funder networks who can help to provide support, both us and, of course, Better Taxes for a Better America, help to round out this capacity. So to know that you are not out there just on your own doing your thing. You've got a big community of folks that you can tap into and your grantees can tap into in order to take some first steps together. So this is, some work in the more of the abstract. We thought it might be fun to try to take some of this and just look at a specific state. So just because they were on my mind, I chose Missouri, and trying to kind of pull forward some of the ecosystem that already exists in this place. And it's really mirrored in a number of other places. So if you look at Missouri, you've got up here at the top the Missouri Budget Project, which is tied into both of those networks I mentioned earlier, but lots of other groups in Missouri who are already working together around tax systems and around revenue generation, and who've already begun to make the translation between revenue and health, and revenue and what's best for kids, and trying to really draw as broad of a coalition as they can. One of the really amazing things as we think about this body of work is that efforts to raise revenues in this kind of work in Missouri is it has to be really broad-based, because the things that families need, they might have childcare concerns and they have healthcare inaffordability and housing is super expensive and their transportation has fallen apart. And so we need a revenue system and a set of players that are focused on revenue who are thinking about all of those things at once to really provide what our families need. And so I've been feeling really good. There's amazing work that is happening in Missouri, and it's just in the nick of time because the legislature in Missouri is currently considering eliminating the state income tax altogether and replacing it with an expanded sales tax, which is a poor idea. And this very poor idea is going to leave a $7.75 billion with a B hole in just Missouri's budget, just of what has to be held. So imagine all the things that we can do for kids and families with that 7.75, or all the things we won't be able to do in Missouri should that go through. And the amazing work of these folks, this capacity that has existed over the years, has been able to draw in new partners, folks who are thinking about what's this going to mean for childcare funding? What's this going to mean for early relational health funding? What's this going to mean for doulas? What's this going to mean for all of the things that our families need? In addition, just this week, one of the business community affiliates came out and said, this is not a great idea. If we think about the health of the business community and what we need for employers and employees, we got to take a pause here and work against this. So I think about in each of the places that you are, there is something like this happening, and it allows you to tap into it and say, boy, my early childhood grantees it would be amazing if their voices could also be part of this, and to also add to the chorus of folks who are saying, we can do better here. We know how to do better. So let me just recap by saying, there's an amazing ecosystem of work that is happening, and there's very many places for you as an early childhood funder to step right on in. Like, the water is warm, the people are nice. There are as many ways for you to really easily step into this space that helps you to achieve the goals that you have set out in your strategic plan, and to see those things through, and very many ways that I think we can do some very good work together. So I'm gonna take this off so I can see you all better. Oh, there you are. And I hope that gives you some confidence that there is some things for you to do. And to put some meat on the bones, I'm gonna pass the mic to two of our colleagues, Sharon Casaradas of the Budget Early Childhood Fund and David Jordan of United Methodist Health Ministry Fund, who will put a little meat on the bones and share a bit about how their foundations are connecting those dots that I was just talking about. Shannon, I think you're up first.
Thanks so much, Amy. For those of you I don't know, it's a pleasure to meet you. Shannon Katsuradas with the Buffett Early Childhood Fund. I direct our policy work. And before I jump in and provide some specific state examples, just wanted to provide a little bit of context. Prior to moving to Nebraska, I actually was the CEO at Kansas Action for Children, where I led our state priorities partnership work through the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, back to Amy's map of who some of the various players are. And that experience really is the lens through which I think about the intersection of early childhood advocacy and tax equity work. I think it really informs the way I think about our work in Nebraska. And then also back to Sarah Prey's map, wanted to provide a little context around the Nebraska circumstances. So we're ahead of the pack in terms of not very good fiscal outlook. This year, we had a $676 million hole in our budget. And just 2 years ago, we had a $2 billion surplus. So Missouri should really be paying attention. That was a result of aggressive income tax cuts. And despite the really difficult fiscal circumstances, we are still in hot pursuit of property tax cuts, and that's all before HR1 hits. So I think the fiscal constraints are very real, making it very challenging to get the things we want to get done for young children and families. And then lastly, by way of context, BECF really, I think we think about our work in terms of research, practice, policy. We wouldn't describe ourselves as a tax funder, but as I look at our portfolio around early childhood, there are several great examples of work that does impact tax policy. And so I just wanted to share a couple of those today. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Can everybody see that? Thumbs up? Yeah? Yeah, great. So what you see on the screen, we have a comprehensive set of tax credits that are focused on childcare in Nebraska. Everything from a child care tax credit to a tax credit that incentivizes private investment to a school readiness tax credit, which is our way of reaching the workforce. And when these tax credits were first implemented, they were poorly utilized. And so the Buffett Early Childhood Fund made the decision to invest what I would consider a relatively small amount in public awareness. We put about $200,000 in over 2 years. And it's really a success story in 2026. So for the child care tax credit, which is capped at 15 million, you see that on the left. That tax credit opened on January 2nd this year, and the annual cap was reached by February 5th. And even a greater success story with respect to the school readiness tax credit, it opened on February 2nd. The annual cap was reached the same day by late afternoon. So with a relatively modest investment, we were able to ensure full utilization of these credits. And I'm just going to stop sharing. Two other great examples, in addition to the tax credit utilization work, this year we're also investing in policy design and revenue analysis. We are anticipating in the next couple of years, likely next year, a push around a child tax credit in Nebraska. We see this as a path towards affordability for childcare for families, as well as other basic needs. And so we've invested in a national organization to provide technical assistance around the policy design and revenue analysis for a handful of our advocacy organizations. And then the last example I wanted to share today is really around shared learning. So Amy really mentioned this, but I think one of the challenges for our early childhood advocates is really feeling like they can engage in a conversation around revenue. So we have partnered with the Children's Funding Project to do a 3-part virtual series for our advocates in Nebraska, as well as one of the 3 sessions will engage those in other red states. but the three parts really include in the first session, we're going to do Nebraska Budget and Revenue 101 to do some level setting for our early childhood advocates to help them engage in the conversation. Then we'll be focused on state dedicated funding in red states in that second session. And then lastly, applying the lessons learned to Nebraska, helping our advocates chart a course forward as we think about what's ahead. And with that, it would be my pleasure to turn it over to David Jordan, who can share some examples from Kansas.
Excellent. Thank you, Shannon. And thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I'm really excited about this discussion. I'm actually going to pull up some slides quickly. And perfect. Can everyone see these? There we go. A lot of conversation has been about tax policy, and we have always been engaged in tax policy. As a small health foundation, our mission is to improve the health of Kansans, but we recognize that without sustainable financing, we can't improve health or help ensure that all Kansas kids can thrive. So a key long-term partner has been Kansas Action for Children, predating Shannon's tenure, but over the 39-year history of the foundation, we've long invested in the SPP partner to ensure that we had strong fiscal advocacy in the state. Another piece of funding, and Amy had mentioned some of this, that we've done in partnership with our SPP partner, is just fiscal research. And I just put two examples up on the screen. One, just recognizing the need to maximize Medicaid, seeing it as a key support for all kids. And then how do we further federal funding for all Kansas families? We really identified financing as a key issue in order, as I said, to ensure that all Kansas families have access to key services. So beyond supporting tax policy, we really honed in on maximizing federal dollars because we recognize there's a connection on federal dollars and the health of our state. So in 1993, Kansas ranked 8th in America's health rankings. In the early 2000s, we ranked about 23rd in across the country in terms of the percentage of our state budget that's made up of federal dollars. And today we rank 48th in the country in the percentage of our state budget that's made up of federal dollars. A big shift is obviously because we're a state that has an expanded Medicaid, but we're not taking advantage of our safety net programs as well as securing federal grants as a state. And as a result, over the last 30 years, Kansas has fallen more than any other state in terms of our health rankings. So you can see some of those impacts because we're trying to do more with less in terms of state general fund dollars. And then if you layer in bad tax policy, the challenges become really significant. So as a small foundation, we really want to leverage all of our assets to support sustainable funding, knowing it has an impact on health and early childhood programming and outcomes. So this means funding advocacy and organizing, working with grantees, supporting research, bringing together groups, and then working directly with state agencies on administrative advocacy, investing in communications and narrative change, playing a role in legislative advocacy, but of course supporting it, and then just making sure we're leveraging the foundations through assets through thought leadership. Just quickly, I mean, these mirror some of Amy's slides, but in Kansas, we are supporting the Kansas Action for Children for both their early childhood work and their SPP work. There's fiscal work, supporting a communication hub to help make sure we can tell the story effectively, supporting grassroots organizing in early childhood and in healthcare, as well as coalition partners. There's also really an important recognition on research. One surprise I'd say over my last 8-year tenure of the Health Fund is how much we invest in research that we then try to apply. Shannon just talked about the Nebraska tax credit. We realized our business tax credit wasn't working, and we learned what Nebraska was doing and then worked to develop research briefs and materials to help promote that tax credit. And ultimately last week we changed legislation. Another piece was we recognized that Kansas wasn't maximizing our Medicaid program regardless of the fact that we didn't expand Medicaid. And we identified opportunities from other states on how we can maximize Medicaid to better serve children and families. And we were heavily involved with the reprocurement process, which really is critical to both improving service delivery and the inclusion of a community reinvestment policy where 3% of any profits of the managed care organizations will go back into the program to serve children and families. So that really is a direct tie back to um, fiscal policy. Um, we certainly play a role in legislative and administrative advocacy as we think about our federal programs. Like many states, for example, we're not taking great advantage of our child care assistance program. Just 3.4% of eligible families are participating. So we know that if we can, and we were one of the only states up until last year that wasn't getting the full match of CCDF dollars. So we're leaving those federal dollars on the program on the table, and families weren't being served. So we worked in partnership with the governor's office to develop a work group to improve the child care assistance program, came up with a set of recommendations, actually just passed legislation this year to improve some of those policies. And I think we can't underestimate the need to make sure we can communicate um, the importance of these programs to families. So we've invested heavily in survey research, communications messaging, uh, nonprofits on the ground to help serve as a resource for both foundations and, more importantly, for the advocates in the fields, and then played a role in lifting up these stories ourselves when appropriate. At the end of the day, I think even as a small foundation, we just recognize how important it is to advocate for strong fiscal policy and the importance of partnerships with other funders that do this. So excited for this discussion. And I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy. So thank you all.
Thanks, David, and I really want to thank all of the presenters. We really had a good time putting this session together, and I feel like we all learned a lot from each other, and how to kind of deepen this work. We've got plenty of time for questions and discussions, and so it looks like any questions that folks had put in the chat were addressed in the chat. But so if you want to come off mute to answer to ask a question or for discussion, raise your hand or just come off mute. Yeah, what are any sparks for you? And my internet, so I might have to ask to of Shauna. Shauna, when you
Kathy, I think we lost you, but I'd be very happy to answer whatever question you're asking me.
I have a question, but I always wait because I think it's better if a foundation has a question. Because I always have a question, as Rena knows. I had a question for Sarah. I was a little surprised by your chart about the regressiveness of state and local taxes. And I'll say the reason why is because I think a lot of the narrative is frequently around property taxes, which gives us the impression that people who own houses are paying the most money. So like I know sales taxes exist and those are very regressive taxes, but like when I think about it, I'm like, wait a minute, aren't homeowners really paying for everything? Because I feel like that's what you hear about a lot, right? Like that's what's in the news a lot. I'm just wondering about that and wondering how that factors into that data and what your thoughts are about that. And I think it probably also ties into some points David and Shannon made about like communications, how do you think about that as part of this work?
Yes, so I'll just say real quick on that. The biggest factor in that is income tax.
Mm.
So that's because that's the bulk of it. It meaning that the income tax is, we would say, not high enough for higher earners, although there are a lot of these initiatives at the state level to increase that. But because exactly as you said, sales tax and, consumption tax and, some of these other taxes are incredibly regressive, you don't have the counterbalance of a more progressive income tax at the state level. And then the other thing I would add to it is that there's also been a trend of decreasing in corporate taxes. And as we always say, who pays corporate taxes? People. So I think there's this like myth that like corporate income tax is paid by this like, sort of, I don't know, like maybe a computer, like an anthropomorphic computer that's like, I'm paying your corporate. No, it's people. It's rich people, right? Mostly. So that's the other factor there, is that because there's been such a decrease in corporate income tax, which, the higher it is, it's paid more by the well-to-do, if you will, or the better off.
Sorry, everyone, my internet has been unstable. Shauna, I was going to ask you a little bit about how you've kind of positioned tax and revenue work to leadership within the foundation. I mean, this is something we're going to explore a little bit at the in-person meeting in a couple of weeks, but just curious about your, some of the ways that you've brought people along.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. That's a really great question, and I think it's an ongoing task. Like it's never quite finished because priorities are shifting. There's emerging issues, but I think HR1 has become the gift no one asked for and no one wanted when it comes to talking about progressive revenue inside of philanthropic circles in general. But as a foundation committed to advancing health equity, education equity, and family economic security, Kellogg really has a broad set of issues that we tackle, and we work at the systems level, we work at the place level. And the thing that I always come back to is, having worked in place and at the national level myself, we always found ourselves not wanting to pit issues against each other. Families needed healthcare, families needed housing, families needed access to high quality early childhood experiences for their children. And the only way that we could solve for these things when we're doing the work closely on the ground, when we're thinking about the opportunities at the national level, and now sitting in this seat, is to grow the pie, as Sarah was talking about. And we always came back to that. Like the only way we were going to actually advance things for kids and families in DC was to ensure that we had sufficient resources. And one of our selling points, particularly when I was in the coalition space in DC, was, we were unlike a lot of places. Looking at the map that Sarah showed, we have a relatively progressive revenue structure and tax code in DC. At the time, we were flush with cash, but the part of the story that I hadn't shared is the day before the council took the vote on birth to 3, the mayor sent a letter saying that you all just passed paid leave. How are you going to pay for paid leave and all of the things in this bill? And suddenly, two essential things that families need, access to paid leave, to welcome a child, to take care of loved ones, was being pit against the needs of early childhood educators and other practitioners that serve very young children. And we found it unacceptable. The compromise was made to pass the bill subject to appropriations for a lot of reasons that had wisdom at the time. But lo and behold, she's actually trying to defund both now, both paid leave and both birth to 3, because we're in a revenue crisis. So I do think that when it comes to selling these inside of foundations, we have plenty of real life examples to point to that in order to achieve the systems building work that we want to do, places need to have the money available to them to do it. And progressive revenue raising is the way we get there. So I hope that answers the question. And I hope folks see that as one way to like educate internally, because taxes are like, it's tax day. I love tax day. A lot of tax folks on this call love tax day, but taxes are often a scary and dirty word in a lot of circles, not just inside of foundations, but in general. People don't like to talk about taxes, but they're our key way of, and I really love the way Shannon described it at the beginning of the call. It's the way we agree to do things together that we care about. And that has been a winning message so far inside of my institution. And it's starting, I'm hoping that more colleagues are going to come alongside curious about revenue raising and taxes as the work continues.
I'm glad that we circled back to the kind of messaging piece, because I do feel like this is an area where we've done some work historically and more work will need to be done. As Shauna just laid out, all kinds of reasons where there's you paying your taxes feels uncomfortable. People don't want to talk about it. There are legitimate concerns about government and what does it mean to put the resources there. And my view is that we see some dovetailing with some of the challenging narratives around early childhood, role of family, role of government. And these kind of all start to come together a little bit. And the more we can work on them together, the kind of more successful all of these efforts are, as we talk about what do we need, like as a people, us putting in money together to advance things for the bigger we. I see this important narrative intersect here.
Yeah, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is this: we can have nice things. I mean, I've witnessed this, I think, in my own county, and I don't have data, but I have 30 years of living here. When I moved to the county I'm in, I was a little bit shocked because everybody used the public things. If you need swimming lessons, you went to the rec center with your kid to get the swimming lessons, right? If you like, everybody used the public things, and the public things were nice. And I have seen over 30 years of living here that, people are starting to go to more private things and fewer public things, which means that, like, it used to be like you would have a greater cross section of people all together, because when the public things are nice, more people will go to them, right? And it makes me think back, and I'll say I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina. So why did we not have good public things? It was like a racial divide. It was the Heather McGhee book, right? It was like, so I feel like that's another reason that may be compelling for people. When you have nicer public things, more people opt into using them. If we want to build a multiracial democracy, like, we need more people investing and more people showing up in those spaces together. Otherwise, people who can afford to will opt out and go buy that somewhere else, right? And then we're not together anymore. And people who can afford it will have nicer things, and people who can't will not. And that will break out along race and class lines.
Well, thank you, Shannon, and thank you guys all for hanging in. If you're coming to the spring meeting, the ECFC spring meeting, please come to our session on Thursday morning. Some of the same folks will be there, but we're going to be going much deeper into a lot of these topics, and there will be prizes. And so you're not going to want to miss it. And stay tuned for more opportunities to get together with the revenue work group. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Happy tax day, and see you soon.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.